I'm Lisa Rotondo-McCord, Curator of Asian Art and Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs here at the New Orleans Museum of Art. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual walkthrough of Buddha, Shiva, Lotus and Dragon, Masterworks from the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection at Asia Society. This exhibition features nearly 70 works of art that have been selected from the foundational gift of nearly 300 objects bequeathed to Asia Society by John D. Rockefeller III and his wife Blanchette. They began collecting Asian art in the decades after World War II, and they envisioned their collection as far more than a personal enterprise. They believed in art and the power of art to facilitate cross-cultural conversation and to influence international relations. And the whole idea behind the collection was to improve relationships between the citizens of the United States and those of Asia. The works on view come from all across Asia, from across the Indian subcontinent into Central Asia, Nepal, Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and on into Indonesia. The exhibition illuminates the impact and transformation of artistic styles associated with Buddhism and Hinduism, belief systems born in India, as they were transmitted across the subcontinent over hundreds and thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Also included are ceramics and metalwork from China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and Thailand, which were created to sustain life both in this world and the next. All of these works reveal the complex networks of artistic exchange through trade and missionary activity and the political and social change that went along with them. The great artistic achievements of Asia's diverse cultures are on view here, and their presentation continues the Rockefellers' vision of sharing extraordinary works of art with audiences in the United States. The Rockefellers had a keen interest in Buddhist art, as is evidenced by the magnificent works in this gallery. In the centuries after the death of the historic Buddha Shakyamuni in about the 5th century BCE, he was represented only indirectly, but by the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, he was represented in human form. And his identity as a Buddha and his supranormal characteristics were indicated on sculptures by a series of auspicious marks known as lakshanas. And in this head of a Buddha from the Gandhara region, you can see those marks very clearly. At the top of his head, there's a cranial bump known as an ushnisha, which represents his cosmic openness as an enlightened being. At the center of his forehead is an urna. It's a mark that symbolizes spiritual truth. And then, of course, his earlobes are elongated, referencing Shakyamuni's early life as a prince. In this sculpture from Bihar in the 6th century, you can see the same auspicious marks in the head of the figure. And you can also see an additional auspicious mark, or lakshana, which is the webbing between the fingers. And this is a mark that is referenced in many textual sources, but it was not common to see it in sculptures in later centuries. This Gupta sculpture is considered to be a sort of classic and idealized form of the Buddha as a perfected being. And you can see the robe, which is a simple monk's robe, which refers to the Buddha's non-attachment to material goods, his rejection of his early princely life. So he takes as his garment the simplest of all garments. And you can see how the robe itself, the folds are indicated by these concentric or parallel lines that run down the length of the garment. The fabric appears almost wet, as though it is clinging to the body of the Buddha. And this Gupta style came to be highly influential across Asia. And in many other sculptures in this gallery, you'll see this same convention of that clinging wet drapery, revealing the perfected physical form of the Buddha beneath it. By the 7th century, Buddhism had become a major religious force across almost all of Asia. The faith itself, as it encountered new traditions and new cultures, also transformed. You see many different Buddhas and other enlightened beings being represented in art that reflect local tradition and the development of the faith. In this unusual and extraordinary bronze from Kashmir, dated to the first part of the 8th century, we see the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, in a very different presentation than in the Gupta bronze we looked at a moment ago. Here he's seated and crowned. His hands are in a position, or mudra, which indicate that he is turning the wheel of the law, which is an indicator that he is beginning his preaching life. And the law, or the Dharma, is also represented in the base. At the center of the base, there is a wheel, so the literal wheel that begins to be turned. What's also remarkable about this base is that there is an inscription at the bottom. For all but 2 of the works in this exhibition, there are no artists whose names are attached to those works, but we do sometimes have the names of patrons who are represented in the works, and that is the case here with this inscription. It is datable to 714, and it indicates that a princess gave the funds for the creation of this work in order to earn merit so that her next life would be better. What's also fascinating about this work is the throne that the Buddha sits on. We often talk about a lotus throne, these sort of abstracted petals upon which a seated Buddha might rest. This is an actual lotus. The base, the stem of the lotus comes out of the base, and the pond is indicated by these 2 figures at either side, who are water figures. They're nagas, serpent-like figures. And out of the mud comes the lotus flower itself. And the Buddha is seated directly on top of that flower form. And the other 2 sides, the stems that come from that central stem, have stupas, which are dome structures that were associated with the relics of the Buddha and used to mark pilgrimage sites for the faithful. So Buddhas are, of course, not the only enlightened beings that are represented in art. Another main group that you see in this gallery are Bodhisattvas, who are enlightened beings who have the capacity to break out of this cycle of rebirth, but who choose not to do so. And they remain as intermediaries to help the faithful on their journey toward enlightenment. The most popular and often most commonly seen Bodhisattva is Avalokiteshvara, who is the personification or embodiment of universal compassion. And Avalokiteshvara is identified through a number of ways. The most common is in the crown, or in the hair, you will see a crown and a small seated Buddha. And that is always a sign that the deity being represented is the Bodhisattva of compassion. And the Asia Society collection is particularly strong in Hindu sculpture created during the Chola period, about the 9th through 13th century in South India. And this fantastic version of Shiva, Lord of the Dance, is a classic example of the sculptures created during that era. Shiva is shown here in this position associated with classical dance. And he is dancing the dance of the cosmos. And the energy that he exerts in this dance is indicated by his hair, which flies up from his head and touches this aureole, this halo of fire, which references the unending cycle of time and the cycle of birth and rebirth. You can see, obviously, Shiva here has multiple arms, and in them he has signs of his power. You have the drum over here that indicates the rhythm of creation. The opposite side, his hand is open. In his palm, he has fire, which references his role as the destroyer of the universe. So you have both creation and destruction in opposition to one another. His hand beneath the drum is upright in a position of protection, and his other hand points to his raised foot, which signifies refuge and deliverance. And at the very base of the sculpture, Shiva is shown standing upon a dwarf-like figure that indicates ignorance and illusion, being trampled below the powerful deity. Now, Shiva's consort, or some would say wife, is the goddess Parvati, who is seen in this case with their son Ganesh, the elephant-headed god. So Parvati, the consort of Shiva, is shown here in this very graceful position. She is a major deity in her own right, being the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. And her grace and beautiful form on the exterior is considered to be a manifestation of her inner spirituality. All of these Chola bronzes are solid cast. They are extremely heavy. They are meant to be seen in the round and were used as processional images. On the bases of several of them, you can see the loops or holes by which the sculptures were affixed to either poles or carriers so that these sculptures could be processed around the temple and around the temple environment for religious celebrations and rituals. Those loops are particularly evident here in this sculpture of Ganesh, one of the most popular deities in the Hindu pantheon. Now, Ganesh is considered to be the son of Shiva and Parvati, and he is the most easily recognizable of the Hindu gods due to his elephant head, which, according to one version of the story, he acquired after his father, mistaking him for a stranger who was preventing him from seeing Parvati, lopped his head off. And Parvati comes actually from her bath, and she sees what's happened, and absolutely distraught, has Shiva promise to revive their son by putting on his body the head of the first living being he comes across, and that obviously was the elephant. Ganesh is the god of new beginnings, of opportunity, of good fortune, and he's also beloved by children. You can see here Ganesh's trunk reaches out to his hand where he has a sweet, clearly the source of his big belly. Hinduism was a major religious, cultural, and political force in Cambodia as well as in India. And at the center of our gallery, we have 4 Cambodian sculptures that were created for these large temple complexes commissioned by various rulers and kings. Here we have a female figure that is really the embodiment of this classic style associated with the 11th century in the Angkor period. It's very smooth in its carving, and the figure seems, while not naturalistic, to be full of a life force and a breath. The sarong or skirt that she wears is very delicately carved, and you can see both the ties near the navel and then the extra fabric coming down toward the hem of the skirt in what's known as a fishtail pattern. Now, without the head and the arms or any other identifying features, we don't know the identity of this female figure other than to assume that she is a woman of power and likely a deity of some authority. The sculpture immediately to her right has an interesting history. It is now identified as a Shiva figure with the multiple arms and the mark at the center of the forehead being the prime indicators of that identity. But a very close examination of this sculpture has revealed that in the headdress, there's actually an abraded image of a seated Buddha, and that the mark at the center was likely added later. And you can see that the carving style is somewhat different for that mark. So the assumption is that this sculpture was originally created for a Buddhist king and a Buddhist building project, but that somewhere along the line, power shifted to a Hindu king and a Hindu project, and this sculpture was literally converted from a Buddhist object to a Hindu object. We'll turn now to some of the metalwork and ceramics that form a core component of this exhibition. The gwei, or ritual food vessel, that we see here is the oldest object in the show, dating to the 6th century BCE. It was created for the most powerful rulers of the era and was used in rituals that connected the ruling class of the day to their deceased ancestors. Geometric designs surround the exterior of the vessel. The top here has this wonderful sort of crown, which can be used then as a base. When the top comes off, the top becomes a footed dish. But what's truly remarkable about this gwei are the dragon handles, which are sculptural and decorative. And of course, the dragon motif becomes very closely associated in later centuries with the imperial ruling class of China. We're going to look at the only other metalwork object in the show, which is a very, very small silver stem cup that was created many centuries later during the Tang Dynasty, which is known as perhaps one of the most cosmopolitan periods in Chinese history. This cup dates from the 8th century and is, as I said, made of silver, which was a highly unusual material for the time. Both its form and its decoration are much more closely connected to Iranian or Sasanian or Sogdian metalworking traditions than to Chinese. This is very closely connected to those objects that were coming across the Silk Road into China and informing not only art in terms of decorative motifs and styles, but materials, as well as dining practices, as the use of a stem cup was not traditional in China during this period. Iranian metalwork also influenced ceramics. In this case, we have two works that were created for tombs. The Chinese had a long history of making ceramic models of objects that could accompany the deceased into the afterlife. And of course, the most famous example of this is the terracotta soldiers for the first Qin emperor. So here, this footed dish is again in the form of a Middle Eastern metal plate. But here, a ceramic version of it, or model of it, has been created for the family of the deceased. Both of these objects are glazed in what is called the Sansai palette, which is characterized by green, amber, and cream lead glazes. What is remarkable about these objects is the addition of the blue glaze. This blue comes from cobalt, which itself was imported from the Middle East. It was not a material that could be found in any great quantity or of great quality in China. So the blue that is used to decorate these clouds and also that adorn the dress of this seated musician are all made from cobalt and are indicators of the status of the deceased and the wealth of the family that commissioned them. This large flask is made of blue and white porcelain, one of the best known products to come out of China. It features a 3-clawed dragon floating across a sea of lotus scrolls. And the dragon, at the time that this flask was made, which is in the early part of the 15th century, was very closely associated with the imperial family. And the kilns at Jingdezhen, which is a very large kiln complex in southern China that originated blue and white porcelain, created works like this for the imperial family. And there are several other examples of a similar form with similar decoration that we see in collections in the Middle East. And so we know that these large-scale objects were used as gifts by the emperor for diplomatic exchange as well as for trade goods. Now, cobalt, which forms the decoration beneath the clear glaze, was not the only medium that was able to be fired at the temperatures required for porcelain. A large vase in the gallery also shows another medium, which is that of copper, and it's copper red. But copper was much more difficult to control in the kiln environment. And you can see here in this vase that the red bleeds at certain points and also reads as gray. So it was an extremely difficult technique, and underglaze copper red objects are much rarer as a consequence. This very large jar is decorated around its surface with the 3 friends of winter, which was a theme very closely associated with the scholarly class. You have the pine, which symbolizes longevity, the bamboo, which symbolizes resilience, and the plum, a regeneration and a sign that with old age can come wisdom and great beauty. For the flowering plum was a tree that lived in China for often centuries, and the most delicate flowers would bloom off of the most gnarled trunk. So the scholar elites adopted this theme almost as their own. It came to signify their class. And this is an extraordinary object, both for its underglaze decoration, the technique itself, but also for its size. This set of foliate bowls and saucers were made in Korea in about the 12th century. They're made of a very high-fired stoneware with this greenish-blue glaze that we refer to in the West as celadon. This is a prime example of the incredible artistry of Korean potters during this time, where there is a perfect fit of the clay body and the thick green glaze. You can see how the glaze thins at the very lip of these flower-shaped petals at the edge of the bowls and of the saucers, and also how at the ribs of each one of those lobes you see a orangish body coming through. These were thought to be made for dining purposes, primarily as containers for treats and edibles at banquets, but they also were given as tribute to Buddhist temples during this period. They are very rare survivors from their era. And now we're going to look at some porcelains from Japan. Whereas China had originated the technology and perfected the technology to create porcelains, some would say as early as the 8th or 9th centuries, but certainly was producing porcelains with underglazed blue decoration in large quantity by the first quarter of the 14th century, it was not until the 17th century that porcelain technology came to Japan. There had been a long-standing tradition, some would say the longest in the world, of ceramic manufacture in Japan, but porcelain itself was unknown until some Korean potters who had been taken captive during an aborted attempt at overthrowing Korea by the Japanese were brought back to the kilns at Arita in Japan. Both of these objects, which are very different in their presentation, were created at that large kiln complex in Arita. Civil unrest in the 17th century made the exportation of Chinese ceramics impossible, and so Western traders turned to Japan to meet the tremendous demand for porcelains in the West. This large bowl here was created at this time and has a remarkable history. It was part of the collection of Augustus the Strong, who is one of the most notable and noted collectors of porcelain from both China and Japan. It is decorated with floral sprays, and it has on the interior a tiger and other animals. The small plate to its right is another product of the Arita kilns, but in a very different way. It is part of the Nabeshima tradition, and the decoration is wholly Japanese. It was not intended for export. It was intended as a gift for a certain clan and domain within Japan. And you have here blue and the green and the brown glazes. All of those glazes have to be fired at different temperatures. So this small dish in and of itself is a technical tour de force. Nanamura Ninsei was close to many of the prominent tea masters of his day. And a part of the tea ceremony was not only the consumption of tea, but also the experience of looking at and appreciating extraordinary objects in the tea room. This jar, which ostensibly was made to hold tea leaves, likely was actually used more as an object of appreciation and conversation. In addition to the mynas that you see going around the shoulder of the vessel, whose plumage is created not only in that dark glaze, but also with overlays of silver, which have now tarnished. You also see small applications of gold throughout the vessel, which indicates that this was a precious object and highly unlikely to be actually used in a tea house environment. Thank you for joining me on this virtual preview of Buddha and Shiva, Lotus and Dragon, Masterworks from the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection at Asia Society. As marvelous as virtual technology is, I hope that those of you who are comfortable doing so and able to do so will come and see this exhibition in our galleries, because nothing can replace the experience of that one-on-one encounter with magnificent works of art.